Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Beyond the Headlines, Funding Disasters in Rural Communities. My name is Regine Webster, and I'm the Vice President of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. This webinar is being co-sponsored by the Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, the Funders Network, and United Philanthropy Forum. Some reminders before we get started. You all probably all know these by now. We're recording the webinar. It'll be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. While you can access Zoom created captions today, we'll have more accurate captions in the recording. You can always submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them at the end of the panel presentation. And if you're on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP for recovery. That's CDP, the number 4 recovery, to share and join the discussion. At the end of the webinar, we will be posting a short survey. So if you guys could just go ahead and complete that, it's really helpful to us as we improve our webinar offerings to better meet your needs. CDP starts all webinars with a land acknowledgement to recognize the original stewards of the land where we live and work. In the spirit of healing, I acknowledge and honor the original people of the land where I am located, now referred to as Nashville, Tennessee. This is among the homelands of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and Yuchi tribal nations, and has been traversed by many Native peoples who use the Natchez Trace foot trails. Despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Indigenous people continue to demonstrate their innumerable talents and gifts today amid continued oppression. So sadly, and somewhat confusingly, there is actually no exact definition of rural. It's a little bit, you know it when you see it. But at the same time, if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. Trying to define rural, then, is a very challenging task, given our country's diverse geography and changing demographics. Rural Health Info Hub has created a search tool that lets you assess your own ruralness. I'm not entirely sure that's a term, but we'll go with it, based on a number of qualifiers. This tool can help determine whether a specific location is considered rural based on various definitions, including those used as eligibility criteria for federal programs. There are 3 government agencies whose definitions of rural are in wide use: the U.S. Census Bureau, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Economic Research Service of the United States Department of Agriculture. The U.S. Census Bureau defines specific kinds of urban entities, urbanized areas or UAs, and urban clusters or UCs, and then defines rural by what is not urban. So therefore, the Census Bureau classification of rural is made up of all territory, population, and housing units located outside of UAs and UCs. The Census Bureau's definition is the only federal definition that applies the term rural in an official statistical capacity, making it the official or ultimately the default definition of rural. It's updated every 10 years based on the decennial census. The Office of Management and Budget defines its areas based on size of population, economic cores, and commuter patterns. It's also used by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to investigate the relationship between health and degree of urbanization and to compare health characteristics in rural and urban counties. The Economic Research Service of the United States Department of Agriculture and the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy collaborated to develop the Rural Urban Commuting Area, or RUCA, system. This method is gaining in popularity at several government agencies, particularly for use in identifying rural areas within metro communities. Now, when you look at this next slide, the dark blue on the left represents the most prosperous rural counties, and then it moves through comfortable, mid-tier, at-risk, and distressed. Over 50% of Black rural residents live in distressed counties compared to 45% Native American rural residents, but just 18% of white rural residents. Persistent poverty counties are those where the poverty rate has been more than 20% over the past 30 years. And of the 395 persistent poverty counties across the United States, over 80% are non-metro or rural. The majority, or 60% of people living in persistent poverty counties are people of color, and 42% of persistent poverty counties are majority people of color. The majority of counties are in the southern half of the country with a high concentration of people of color living in persistent poverty counties located in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas. When we think about rural employment, I think most of us automatically envision farmers. It turns out agriculture actually only counts for less than 6% of rural employment overall. Manufacturing and agriculture, which are the two historically dominant sectors in rural areas, now account for less than 1 in 5 rural jobs combined. Education, healthcare, and social assistance make up just over 22% of rural jobs. Retail trade makes up 11%. Flipping now to this next slide. This slide is what I would call a doozy. And we don't expect you to be able to read this right now. It's from a report on rural policy released last year by the Brookings Institute and sent to me by a colleague down at Philanthropy Southeast. We wanted to share it to highlight the complexity of rural and tribal funding and policy in the United States. And we promise to share the link to this graphic and the report in a follow-up email. So what's important to grasp, though, when looking at this, is that there are 400 federal programs in 13 departments, including 10 independent agencies and over 50 offices and sub-agencies. And this graphic here, it doesn't actually even show all of those departments, independent agencies, and sub-agencies. So with that background of rural in America, I'd now like to introduce our speakers. I'm so excited to introduce our panel members with us today, and I look forward to the information that they will share with us to deepen all of our understanding of rural. So Brian Fogel is president of the Community Foundation of the Ozarks, responsible to the board of directors to carry out the mission and action plan of the organization. Prior to joining the Community Foundation in 2008, he spent 30 years in banking in Springfield. He's also a member of our CDP Advisory Council, and his motto is, quote, often wrong, seldom in doubt, end quote. Carrie Cullen is the director of CDP's Midwest Early Recovery Fund. Previously, Carrie served as the Humanitarian Special Projects Team Lead at Lutheran Social Services of North Dakota, where she worked on disaster case management and recovery program, served as project manager for the Midwest Consortium for Disaster Services, managed special events for New American Services, and initiated and led the agency's work with victims of labor trafficking. Don Phoenix is principal of the Sankofa Group, LLC, specializing in affordable housing and community development consulting. He recently retired after 27 years as regional vice president for NeighborWorks America, where he led the corporation's Katrina rebuilding effort. So now I'm going to dive over to all of you. I'm going to ask some questions, and I'm looking forward to learning from you. Carrie, let's start with you. Why is it important for funders to pay attention to rural communities generally, but also after a disaster?
Thanks, Regine, and it's just such a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. So I think that my overall answer seems a little bit simplistic, but at the end of the day, rural America matters because people matter, and there are people that choose to live and work and make their lives in rural places. And there's a lot of reasons why we choose to live and work in these places. Rural America matters because it's where, we've talked about this, where our food, our manufacturing, our energy, and a lot of our industry really begins in this country. But it's also an equity issue, right? So first, I think about this, rural communities have historically experienced marginalization and disinvestment. especially as you were talking about earlier, those communities that are predominantly Black and Indigenous. And for me, as I work in the Midwest, it's the Upper Plains. In the Upper Plains, these communities are primarily located on our Native American reservations, where we know racism and the intentional erasure of culture and people means that many of them live in persistent poverty. Also, we're just thinking about, according to some measures, nearly 37% of US residents live in rural classified areas. And yet we know that the amount of dollars that are going to those areas is not anywhere near 37% for either government or philanthropy. Second, and we noticed this especially through COVID, but when we knew that the rural rates of infection and death have been higher per capita in rural areas than urban areas, we also see this in other different events that rural communities tend to be more vulnerable to shocks and stressors. And as these shocks and stressors cause the loss of housing, of business, and livelihoods, we also know that can be much more challenging for these communities to recover. And third, I think rural communities are really on the front line of climate change. And we really need to invest in helping them to adapt. One example that I would give is just the loss or the reduction of rural grasslands in North Dakota because of climate change. And this we know may lead to increased flooding in urban and rural areas downstream on the Missouri River. And then it also leads to increased drought, which causes food supply and water issues and really impacts all of us in some ways. So finally, when I think about why it's important for us to pay attention to rural communities, it's because they have so much to teach us. So many of those who are living in these places have lived there for generations. Their understanding of stewardship and conservation, their natural mutual aid efforts, and their commitment to community-based solutions can and should really inspire us all. So why do we need to pay attention to rural communities? Because they really matter, and because it's an equity issue. And because if rural communities don't recover, it really impacts all of us and our futures.
Thanks for that, Carrie. Brian, over to you. Local government and small communities don't have the same resources as urban or even suburban areas. How does that play out in terms of needs and the kind of support grants you've made after a disaster?
Well, Regine, let me say up front, it's just a privilege to be with Don and you and Carrie and to be on this panel. So thank you for asking. I guess I would reflect back to that slide you showed just a little bit ago of 400 different programs, 50 offices, and in areas that often the city clerk might be their one paid person. And if they have an emergency manager, I was thinking of one county we work with CDP on flooding, that they had an emergency manager that also wore two other hats. So again, it's a capacity issue. And, not having planners, not having the staff is how do they access all these programs that come with relief efforts and recovery efforts. I think one of the first things that we try to do is go into the community and be present and give them hope and also set expectations. I was thinking of one community that was hit by a tornado, and they had a goal: we're going to rebuild in 90 days and we're going to put up metal buildings in our downtown. And we tried to slow them down and say, think of your community 5 years from now, not tomorrow, not 6 months from now, but also recovery and relief is going to take a while. So I think some of the things we can do as a community foundation is just set expectations, but also give them hope. The other thing we've learned working in smaller communities and rural areas is the recovery is going to look really different. They may not have the nonprofit infrastructure there. So it may be volunteer groups or church groups or et cetera that work through there. So we've done a lot of grant making in more non-traditional areas, and I think that helps a lot. And again, the other thing is making sure they know that we are here for the long term. Community foundations typically focus more on recovery and saying that we'll be here this year, next year, or 5 years from now, I think is very, very important to let them know we'll walk along with them.
That is super helpful. Thank you so much. Now, Don, you've worked in Appalachia and you've worked in the Delta, and yet you say that the needs are the same in both areas. Can you help unpack those needs for us? Don, you might be on mute. All right, Carrie, I'm going to head over to you real quick, and then Don. Oh, you're here.
I'm here. I just wanted to thank the Center for this opportunity to participate in the very important conversation. And as you noted, the region in which I work consists of 13 states plus the District of Columbia, and from West Virginia down to Louisiana and from Maryland down to Florida. So we contain some very tough areas. When we think about the Gulf, particularly the comparing Appalachia with the Delta, they have more in common than most people believe. All of them hope for a better life for their families. And as depicted here, obviously the difference is race. But nowhere else in the country, race and place really matters more. But both communities experience persistent poverty forever. Both have suffered from historic extraction of resources. In the Delta, it was cotton, in Appalachia, it was coal. And both suffered from labor extraction in the Delta through slavery and in Appalachia through the coal mines. And both extractions, we need to note, were supported by public policy. And today, each has a lower level of employment, older population due to out-migration for better opportunity of younger folks, and a lack of capital, that steady investment. And both have weak municipal infrastructure throughout. All of these factors make these communities highly vulnerable to disaster, and it makes recovery more challenging. Yeah, but deficit is where we basically highlight when we talk about the rural areas. But I would like to talk about some of the great stuff. And I want to point out that Hope in Mississippi Delta and Fahey in Appalachia have done a great job of creating measurable impact in those communities. Both import resources from outside to support local investment. And they do that primarily through their CDFIs. Fahey has a network of nonprofits that really bring capacity to smaller communities, otherwise would not happen. Hope has a small city initiative in the Delta that supports small municipalities in their planning and resource development. And of course, Hope has been able to create a mission-driven transformation deposit program initiative that attract corporate public dollars and lend those out to the communities. So both, well, I think I need to note that both are involved in major policy work. Together, they have collaborated with other major organizations around the country in serving persistent poverty to form what we know of today as the Partners for Rural Transformation. And of course, that organization consists of organized national voices for rural communities, particularly those of persistent poverty. Together, they believe that they are stronger and they should prosper together. And they've built internal infrastructure, including staff, and they've been involved in major advocacy work and resource development work. So I like to say that the folks in the rural area make it happen. You know, they're very resourceful, very resilient.
I appreciate those sentiments so much living here in Tennessee. So thank you so much for those. Hey, Carrie, you're up. I think when people envision rural areas, they think of the Marlboro Man, rugged cowboys and farmers. And we showed some data at the beginning, but what is a rural community like to you?
Yeah, well, I was just listening to both Don and Brian and thinking about, even my vision of rural America, which comes from, growing up in a small town, in farming community to just working in the Midwest is expanded by other rural areas in our country. So, I think that, the top picture, this red barn on this slide, is what a lot of people, at least in the Midwest, think about too when they think about rural America, right? It's these kind of idyllic farming kind of pasture scenes, right? There's probably, if you think about this one, there's probably a small town nearby with at least one grain elevator and a church and a bar for sure. And there might be a gas station if you're lucky. But I actually think that the other two images, along with, I could add thousands and thousands more, just really create a better picture that's closer to reality. So you talked about them at the beginning, but there's a few myths really about rural America that I just have to mention, right? So there's this idea that it's farmers everywhere. And while farming and agriculture is extremely important, I think you pointed out that fewer than 6% of rural Americans are employed in agriculture. So there's so much more going on in our rural areas. I think people also tend to believe, again, and you pointed this at the beginning, that it's a majority, especially the Midwest, right? Majority white, and there's little racial or ethnic diversity. But we know that that's just not true. The last myth that I always get from people, and I hear often, is that it's really like, it's Mayberry, right? So it's quiet, it's stuck in the past. There's this ideal that somehow we all need to get back to, and we should return to that. But we know, right? Rural America is diverse. It's full of entrepreneurs. It's innovative and it's changing. And some parts are resource rich and thriving, where others are struggling to adapt. This middle picture is of a project that we did with the Midwest Early Recovery Fund supporting Columbus Junction, Iowa. So for me, Columbus Junction has really become a more realistic picture of rurality. The school district covers a population of about 4,400 people. And in 2019, enrollment at the school district was over 50% Hispanic, 20% Asian, and 30% white. English is not the primary language spoken in approximately half of the district's homes. So with them, and with that community, we funded a Spanish-speaking COVID navigator through the League of United Latin American Citizens in Davenport, Iowa, this person helps families access resources in their primary language. And we also funded a technology advocate for the school district to keep up with families needing access to technology resources in languages other than English. We funded communities with similar needs for local and culturally aligned and linguistically appropriate services for East African, Latinx, Karen, and other immigrant populations in Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, and Minnesota, and I could go on. And we know that many of these rural communities are working really hard to create inclusive spaces where everyone has access to information and resources in their primary languages. So there's complexity, right? And there's diversity, and there's strengths and there's weaknesses. And there's also significant challenges and opportunities in each and every rural community. And so what we said at the beginning, right? If you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. If you've met one person living in rural spaces, you've met one person. So it's a much richer and broader picture than when we sit and think about it, than I think many of us imagine at the top of our minds.
Yeah, that's a really helpful depiction. And thank you for the Mayberry reference, Carrie. That's going to stick with me for a little while here, I think. Don, during our planning call, you mentioned flexible patient funding. Tell us what that is and why funders should develop an attitude of patience. All right, I think we might have a little audio hiccup with Don. So Carrie, we'll go to you next. As a funder in the Midwest, what do you think it takes for funders to work in rural communities?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is maybe part of what Don was going to talk about with patient funding and money. So I hope that we get back to him. But I really do think that engagement with individuals in rural spaces really requires us to put aside some of our timelines and our schedules and spend some time listening fully and really understanding the community. I say take the tour, right? So on the surface, these communities may look and feel alike, but if we listen to each unique history and story, it's really going to set a stage for that partnership and build trust for whatever comes next. So rural people are proud of their communities and their culture and their history. And so as you engage, take time to visit those local spots, go to the cafes, stay in the local bed and breakfast or the motel, allow community members to show you the challenges that they're trying to overcome. And although COVID has taken some of this away from us, I think that face-to-face time is absolutely essential when we're working in rural communities. For me, as a funder who engages in community only after disaster, part of the challenge I have to overcome is that I feel like I helicopter in with outside ideas and really left soon after. I often think about my role in disaster recovery funding as engaging with communities to remind them of a couple things. One, they're not alone, right? That I need to listen deeply enough to provide what I hope for is the right resources at the right time, and to stay long enough to really leave something behind. Part of the role is to also raise a flag and remind us all that the diverse institutions, families, and communities are worthy of recognition, attention, and investment, especially as they face post-disaster challenges. And I hope what we really leave behind is better access to this just wide variety of resources, whether it be funding or skills and volunteers or information that can impact their community. And we really leave the capacity for them to engage with other funders or experts. We build bridges to others in the disaster recovery ecosystem and in all of those spaces where there's need. And finally, I think we really need to think about and understand the importance of anchor and community-based institutions, right? The churches, the schools, the banks, the philanthropists, and the nonprofits in the community are really central to co-designing solutions. The scope and the scale of our rural communities' issues and challenges are different from urban areas. They require distinctive models and solutions that respect and represent the people of rural spaces. Working here requires flexibility in who to fund. Brian talked about small nonprofits. They may not be any nonprofits, or they may even be emerging and just getting started. Can we fund those types of organizations moving forward? Our practices that require lots of people to get involved in multiple committees and coalitions and groups may just not work in these types of spaces. We also need to just acknowledge that there's some strength in the social capital and the community and family networks in these spaces, and really build on that as we plan together what the future can look like. And the other thing I want to just say is that we have to think about the place-based funding partners and having intentional relationships with them. So for us, we regularly partner with United Ways or community foundations, because we know that they're the ones that know and are committed to their communities in ways that we can never be as quote unquote outsiders. And their long-term investment is what can truly lead to addressing root causes and disparities and inequities in these communities. And ultimately, that's what leads to successful recovery and thriving communities. So get to know your community foundations and those United Ways in rural communities, and really invest in relationships with them as you're thinking about funding.
We do love our community foundations and United Ways, don't we? Don, can you hear me? Can we hear you?
Yeah, I'm here now. I think I'm not going to
Oh, great.
mute button anymore.
Okay, great. I'm going to repeat my question for you. That, when we first got on our planning call together, you mentioned flexible patient funding. And so I'm just curious if you could explain that and tell why funders should develop an attitude of patience.
Yeah, I've come to this from my experience over my career as a banker, as dean of city government, and at dean of NeighborWorks. We wanted to leverage our money and fund for results and be able to show the impact of our investments. And really, I've learned that the communities that we're working in, particularly in rural areas, are really suffering from generational challenges that must be overcome. And that takes some patience. And that philanthropic investment, I learned, attracts corporate and public fundings to these communities. So it's important that the monies are invested in a way that will be useful for these communities and that they can use to leverage other corporate and government money. So that's what I mean by flexibility. With that said, I'm talking about long-term, flexible, unrestricted investments that are needed. And the expectation of what's going to follow from that initial investment must be calibrated. Recognize that the value of collateral in the rural areas is usually less than in the urban, and that the physical and development infrastructures are not in place. So we have to spend a lot of money in the front just building those infrastructures that are needed. And capacity in a lot of places, like I've noted with Hope in Mississippi and with Fahey in Appalachia, the capacity must be mobilized to the impacted areas. It's not going to be there just because, right? And there are few organizations that could really attract large investments that are needed to work with these communities. So just understanding that. And finally, just realizing that it takes more time for community-driven solutions. I mean, it's okay if we go to a community with some end in mind, but it's not always what the community is looking for. And sometimes it takes backing up a moment and taking care of some of those things I just talked about, the infrastructure and all, before we could really drive change. And I'm going to give a little example. It took place in June, Mississippi, where rightfully so, that community wanted a grocery store, and the funders envisioned this grocery store that was a physical place. And after a while, working with the residents and just beginning to understand, realized that the best use for an area that's desperate in terms of space and area would be to have a online grocery store. So they were successful, the funders supported it, creating the Mississippi Delta Online Grocery Delivery Program, which was an ideal way of getting groceries in some of the, I hate to use that terminology, I'm gonna say some of the areas that don't have really groceries available to them. So I just wanted to offer those thoughts around what should feed patients.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, Don. Brian, let's go over to you. Looping back to one of the things that Carrie said was a reference to place-based funders. And to me, that's the essence of a community foundation. Can you talk about your role in responding to disasters as a community foundation?
Yeah, and I'll go back to something Don said and also Carrie said. So he talked about extraction, and so many of our small communities have seen jobs go, they've seen their children go, and they've seen their resources go. And so they can't help but be skeptical of outsiders, as Carrie called often and or mentioned earlier. And so they're skeptical, and they're thinking, here's somebody else from the outside to take something away from me. That's my experience. So what I think makes the community foundation model work so well is our affiliates are in the community. They're the people that know their community, care for their community, and know how to get things done more than anybody else. And so we can work with them, and they have trust. So versus us coming in and trying to build that trust, they already have it. We can work through them. Something else Don said that we try to do is offer that patient flexible capital. Most public funding, federal funding or state funding, has a whole bunch of requirements tied to it. Ours don't. We have the funding that's more flexible and we think more responsive. So we try to fund things that public dollars don't do. And again, it's that patient capital that is so needed. And then the final thing I would say, and again, just building on what Don said, is once a community figures this out and can do it on their own, you're helping build that capacity that wasn't there. They build the confidence. Look what we did, and look at the capacity we built. So actually, I think a natural disaster, you can actually build upon that and make your community stronger, more vibrant, because you've got that confidence that you did this. And again, it wasn't somebody from a state capital or Washington, D.C. coming in and doing it to someone or for someone. They did it themselves. They just need the resources to do that and to accomplish that.
That's amazing. And I so appreciate how the three of you are building on each other. And I almost feel like well, maybe I'm dreaming, but in my head, I'm sitting around the table with the three of you, just soaking your wisdom all in. Don, you spent 27 years at NavalWorks and recently even received the key to the city of New Orleans for your work rebuilding after Katrina. Give us your top 3 lessons that you learned that are important for funders to know after a disaster and when working in rural areas.
I learned so many lessons. I've been trying so hard to get it down to 3, but I think I got it. Let me try to go with this. The lesson that I learned in the sort of retrospect was that we can't wait for a crisis to think about capacity in these communities. And that we need to continue to, upfront, fund local disaster management plans for communities. And within that management plan, disaster management plan, they need to concentrate on building a structure for developing business community plans, business continuity plans for these service providers. And I found that out because when I tried to contact the nonprofits that we support in the area, they were wiped out, and they were more concerned about their ability to just be able to get back on their feet. And we learned that we needed to do some things differently up front to prepare them for their continued ability to provide services in disaster, because they are impacted too, because they are part of the community. The other thing that I've learned around this not waiting is policy advocacy to address inequities that contribute to unproportionate impact on vulnerable populations. We don't need to just talk about it after we're in the midst of trying to respond, but we need to work on it when there is calm, such a thing. And the other is fund working capital. That was alluded to earlier. Folks need money to be able to do work. As a public sector administrator, our money is, that money is pretty cumbersome. And even with the last experience with COVID, we learned that this reimbursement approach are very challenging for nonprofits. They need to have some money to begin to do the work because the way that they get most of their money is reimbursement. That's tough. The second thing is community development entities need to lead, not to be driven by resources. And I even had to deal with that a lot. Don't do it because I have the money for you. You need to be driven by the voices of the community, not what I want done, but let me know that I'm off and that this is what you really need. And then be very careful in listening to who is actually telling the story. Yeah, I found that when you make an assessment after disaster, this would happen to Katrina, that there are everybody out there that's a spokesperson, but just dig into the real story, the people that are impacted. And to do that we have to have a means for full and equitable participation by all stakeholders, including marginalized populations, in the planning and decision-making and leadership that reflect the demographics of the community. This takes more time for community-driven solutions. So I realized that patience is actually needed. And I realized that it's needed because the community is traumatized. Residents, not only the residents, but the service providers are all traumatized, and we need to really deal with them first, their mental health and everything else, before we could look at the bricks and mortar. And we need time to build coalitions and delivery systems, because I found that the most effective delivery system we built in responding to Katrina was one where we had government, lefty, and the corporate sector at the table together. And I like to quote, I could talk about Pastor Shan as one that was heavily impacted by pulling those resources together and making a difference in that area. So I promise that I'll hold myself to 3, and those are my 3.
I like those 3. I think those were incredibly helpful. And I also know that through our conversations that some of the work that you've done is in Broadmoor, and that's where one of our CDPers lives. So I just wanted to thank you for your work there and that sort of shared life experience between all of us. Hey, so Brian, you and I have worked together for several years through the Philanthropic Preparedness, Resilience, and Emergency Partnership that CDP administers with the Funders Network. Can you tell us briefly what the program is and what you've gained from participating in it?
Yeah, it has been such a rewarding experience. First, I would say the friendships I've built with you and others have been invaluable. And as you said in the opening, I was a banker, and I'd go to these banker conferences, and everybody would shake hands very politely. And in prep, what I noticed is everybody hugs. So it is a caring group of people that I just love to hang with, number one. The second thing, the first natural disaster I was involved in, I spent just a lot of time learning and calling other foundations and others to learn about how this whole thing works. And one of the things that this has done is that, and I'm going to brag on CDP, the playbook that is put together, the resources that you all have created are so helpful. So rather than recreating all of this every time, a new map, a new strategy, you all have captured all that best practices that we now have access to. And then again, getting back to the relationships is when something happens, I've got, again, 20 community foundations and the Funders Network and CDP of folks I can reach out and call, and our staff can reach out and call and say, hey, have you ever run into this, or we're running into this? Not just, again, with disasters, but with just the work we do each and every day as grant makers and collaborators and leaders. So it has been a wonderful experience. I've been able to see communities I would have never seen in my life because we're, again, place-based, and we get to go into it like Fargo or Cedar Rapids or other areas and learn about what they do, how they do it, and learn from that. And that has been just such a rewarding, valuable experience for our whole organization.
That is awesome, and I'll echo everything that you just said, just from my desk as well. All right, we're going to move now to our question and answer section in a minute. So for those of you in the audience, please go ahead and put questions in the Q&A box on your screen. And while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I want to pose a question to the 3 panelists. Now I'm going to time you. You each get just 1 minute so that we can go to the Q&A. One thing you've all talked about in your work is the issue of scale. So often funders start with a pilot program, but success metrics look different in rural communities. So can you each talk a bit more about how scale impacts the work that gets done after a disaster? Again, you have 1 minute. Let's go in alphabetical order. Brian?
So again, a little goes a long way in rural areas, and I'll contrast 2 different areas. We worked in Joplin, an urban area, rebuilt a lot of homes there. The average rebuilding was $33,000 to do that. We worked in another area that was flooded. The average cost was $7,500. It's because there was volunteers there was lumber donated, there were churches and others that joined in. And that's what, when we talk about scaling, and I hear national funders saying we can't scale it in rural America, that frustrates me, because what they don't understand is it's a different scaling, and a little goes a long way. There aren't the plethora of these large nonprofits, but folks are resourceful, to quote Don earlier. So again, that would be a little goes a long way.
Harry.
Yeah, I would just add to that that, for us, it's a lot about just this idea of building the capacity of those who are already doing the work in the community, right? So there's typically somebody who is, coordinating things and jumping in, and maybe it's, the church secretary or the county administrator. There's somebody that's kind of gluing all those things together already. And so, what we found that if we can kind of find a person or find that person and really give them the resources to coordinate and to build kind of a coalition and whatever size recovery group that they can come up with, whether it's the 3 people or the 20 people, but they get around the table and there's a lot of grit and a lot of ability to move things forward in some really creative and ingenious ways. But we have to support that. We have to support that person to really coordinate and move things forward.
Okay, Don.
When we're talking about rural communities, scale is somewhat nuanced, right? It's not scale as we know it, but more of measuring what has changed in that community. And what did one house in this community do in terms of spurring property values, the creation of recreation centers, improving schools, and the physical infrastructure that need to be improved in order to do just a few houses in that community. It's more long-term results, but it's really how you measure impact of what changes in the community. Recognize that rural communities are continuously crippled by natural and economic disasters, but the damage is not concentrated like in urban areas. You can always see scale, and it's not due to the distance between places. So scale is not easily attainable the way that we think of scale. The physical infrastructures are not properly installed as in urban areas, particularly in some of these communities I talked about, where there have been systematic discrimination. And so it's required more money to take care of those facilities in order to produce, say, one house. And also, you may want to consider comparatively the creation of one job out of a total of maybe 89 in the rural area is a big deal. And to do 5 homes based on the things I talked about in the universe of a possibility of only 200 is really great. And I want to say that monies are flushed through inequitable and inadequate systems in public and private sectors. So we need to adopt relative matrix based on the reality on the ground. Matrix need to be designed in concert with the community. Look to create networks for collective capacity and scale instead of looking at individual organizations. And I think my 1 minute's up.
Thanks everybody for that. I appreciate the speed and also, again, the wisdom that was imparted. So we've received actually a large number of questions in advance, and so I'm going to work through that list as well as any that we received in the Q&A answer box. And as a reminder, CDP webinars are aimed at providing education to the philanthropic community. So while all are welcome, we will focus the questions on funder issues. So question first, and we'll see if collectively we can figure out if it's Brian, Carrie, or Don that want to answer it. So are funders interested in funding national nonprofit organizations to support local level community rebuilding? And if so, what can national organizations do to make the case that our services are needed by the community?
Well, I'll jump in. Again, in the there's relief, which you get a lot of the national folks, Red Cross, et cetera, that go in there initially. What we have done in the Community Foundation of the Ozarks world, we focus on recovery. So we're going to be there after a lot of the national organizations leave, and they do great works from the Salvation Army to others. And they have a tremendous funding mechanism themselves to be able to get funding. What we try to do is bring in, as Don called it, that patient capital, that long-term, where we, again, I look at one community, we made our final grant on the 5th anniversary of the tornado. So that's what we try to focus on. because there aren't those national organizations typically working on recovery long-term efforts.
That makes sense. I'm looking at the open questions that we have here in the Q&A, and I think several of them bundle into one. So if I can take moderator privilege and do a little bit of a question reduction here. Carrie, I'm going to put this out to you, please. I think if I were to distill this question, it comes down to this: how can rural nonprofits, rural and or small nonprofits, develop relationships with national nonprofits or national funders in advance of a disaster event?
Such a good question. I mean, I think, and it's hugely important that we start to have those relationships, obviously, before these events happen. We talk about, we don't want to be exchanging business cards in the middle of a crisis, right? To have these built in. So there's a couple avenues that come to mind right away. And one, I think we've talked about this idea of like looking at it as a regional or a statewide basis first before you think about it nationally. So I encourage, again, back to the community foundations, like understand who those local place-based funders are, have conversations with them, and understand what they're doing and what they're interested in, and kind of what bridges they can help you build. Before you even start to look at some of these bigger ones. When it comes to connecting with nonprofits, I mean, there's some large nonprofits that have that local affiliate or a regional affiliate or somebody that you can go to, and so it's creating those relationships with them and those friendships before anything even begins to happen, so that you can make that ask. I think that we also know that a lot of our small rural communities don't get the help that they need because they don't ask. And so I would just always encourage communities, like, don't be afraid to make that ask. Make sure you kind of really understand where you're going and what you want to do in a little bit, right? But then find somebody that you can talk to, ask for advice, and ask for those connections and that help to do it. And if you're persistent, hopefully you'll find somebody that can kind of broker some of those relationships for you and move you forward in that.
Great help. I have a question here from an anonymous attendee that says, foundations still work around deadlines, which often do not meet community needs when disasters arise. What can be done so that foundations are more flexible with funding and respond timely? A couple of thoughts that if I can go ahead, I'm actually going to answer this as a moderator. 3 thoughts. First is I'd encourage you to read the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy report, and perhaps even more importantly, take a look at the associated mapping platform that's created by Candid. And what you'll be able to do there is to search on which funders are responding, which funders are providing grants in any, you can choose the geography you want to narrow down on. And that'll give you a sense for what funders are funding it in your region, your area. I will say that the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, I am completely smitten with, quite frankly, and the work that they're doing to encourage flexibility around timelines and reporting structures and all of that patient capital that Don was referring. So I'd encourage you to look at that and see which types of funders are engaging in more and more trust-based philanthropy. And then also I'll just add a caveat, which is to say that foundations, they themselves have their own accountability processes that could be, senior leadership, it could be board of directors or trustees. And so ultimately foundations and funders, they themselves have their own accountability mechanisms. So I just offer that as a way to share some grace with foundations and funding entities. I also, hold on, it went away. Where'd it go? Let me go now to a question that was posed in advance of the conversation, and Carrie, it's a little bit of the reverse of what you just answered, which is, what are the best strategies for identifying organizations to work with on the ground after a disaster? And the person who wrote the question said, this has been the issue for us in the wake of disasters, especially in rural communities. And how do we make sure that our partners on the ground reach the most marginalized communities? So Brian, Carrie, Don, I'm not sure which one of you wants to jump in on that one.
Well, yeah, that's a tough one. Realizing that there were nonprofits on the ground in New Orleans in the Gulf area, but we realized that they didn't have capacity. So what we did was we worked very hard to build partnerships, uh, building a relationship between a high capacity organization, even if it wasn't a local organization, with that nonprofit that's on the ground, realizing that the organization coming from the outside would not be the driver of the mission or the vision, but help in executing their plans, whatever they come up with. So just matching the capacities, bringing people together for bigger, greater.
Yes, and yes, and yes. Well, I'm looking at the clock and want to be mindful of all of our time, and so I'm going to take us to close. But as we begin to wrap up, I just want to provide the audience with some of the key takeaways from our conversation and elevate what Brian and Carrie and Dawn really brought forth. A few things. First, learn what the community wants and needs. Sometimes funders provide resources for a specific program idea that they have, rather than asking the community what it requires. After a disaster is not the time for a new pilot program. Rather, support the community to meet the needs that it identifies. Let them tell you what's important. Rural areas do magic with money. If you've ever been to a country potluck, you know that rural communities can make a dollar stretch like no one's business. They work together and share resources, amplifying impact. Money goes a long way if you give them the flexibility and freedom they need. Every disaster in a rural community is a low attention disaster. It's rare that any disaster receives outside news coverage, and even when it does, media attention is fleeting. FEMA and NGO resources are few and far between. You've got to look beyond your normal sources to find out who's in need and where they are. Community foundations are a critical partner. Sometimes people just need a piece of equipment or a storage facility, and they'll be able to do transformational work. That's hard for bigger funders to support, so you use your local resources such as community foundations. They know who's in the community, what they're doing, and where the need is. They can spread your donation out in dribs and drabs to meet those needs. Cultivate patient money. Time sometimes moves slower in rural communities. It's not as easy to move resources, bring people together, and economies of scale just look different. But if you're patient and allow the process to unfold naturally, your return on investments on human scale will be incredible. CDP has many resources, including several funds devoted to disaster philanthropy. Look at disasters and responses. Disaster profiles provide regular information about the impact of a disaster and the needs of the community to inform philanthropy on how they can help. There's a monthly newsletter filled with information and regular blogs. And CDP staff are always available to provide guidance and if you need more in-depth assistance, they also provide a variety of consulting services. You can find out more about our work at disasterphilanthropy.org. And then to those of you who might be planning disaster funding, CDP has many additional resources and information in the Disaster Philanthropy Playbook. You can find it at disasterplaybook.org. Okay, everybody, this is a wrap on our 2021 webinar series. We hope you've learned from our 13 webinars this year and have started making changes in your own funding practice. We look forward to seeing you next year. And if you've missed any of our webinars this year, they're all available on our website and on our YouTube channel. And please do not forget to complete our post-webinar survey to help us plan for next year. So this is all the time that we have for today's webinar. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, and the Funders Network and United Philanthropy Forum. And special thanks to Brian, Carrie, and Dawn for taking the time to share their insights with us. I'd like to double down on thanking the CDP staff team that works really hard to put together these webinars. Really appreciate all of you. Now, if you do have any questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to Tanya at tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you all so much and have a great afternoon and happy holidays.